Hello and welcome to this first lesson of newspapers. This actually is the beginning of, I suppose, what is two schemes of work because there are two set texts for the newspapers medium. However, before we get into the set texts, there are a couple of short introductory lessons, of which this is the first. This first introductory lesson is about news values and agenda setting, and there'll be some analysis in this as well. And as you can see from the bottom, we look at newspapers for all five of our key areas. Context obviously is something we look at for each of our different media and set products, but media industries, audiences, media language and representations, we look at the whole lot. But as I said, these first couple of lessons are really just introductory to bring you up to speed with some information you need to know about newspapers before you can study them, and also a little refresher on some textual analysis skills to do with language and images and so on. So for this particular session, the objectives really would be to explore the different ways in which news selects stories and sets agendas. And also, hopefully by the end of this session, you will understand the key differences between tabloid and broadsheet newspapers. And I always start sessions about newspapers with an age-old question and a debate I always really enjoy having in the classroom as to which is more real, newspapers or TV news. And of course, this is a really interesting debate based on a lot of people's own experiences about the way that they view the media and see the world. I always incorporate a few other questions into this to do with what is your criteria as to whether something is real or not. Think about representational theory. Of course, this question really does beg the question about how is reality represented rather than something being actually real or more real than another thing. So theories such as Stuart Hall's constructionist approach or the idea of mediation must come into this. And of course, whilst I've been asking this question for many years, that I've been teaching as to which is more real, newspapers or TV news, we have slowly, or maybe not so slowly, seen the rise of social media and online media, but arguably replacing both of these older forms of media, old media and newspapers and TV news, as being replacing the way we gather and collect our news. And of course, the other aspect I throw into this, just to try and confuse as many people as possible, is to suggest that maybe is hyper-reality an inevitable conclusion to this discussion, seeing as what we see in the newspapers or on the TV is never obviously a straightforward version of reality, but a distorted, bent, mediated, focused version that's been twisted and manipulated many times over, particularly as we now see that, for example, something like a piece of news that you would see online may have originally started in a newspaper, may have been covered by a TV news, may have been adapted and edited. Do we end up into an aspects of hyperreality? As I said, I really enjoy this debate with students. I often find that I'm going to generalize here that most students I've taught in my teaching career have tended to side with television news over newspapers. That's not to say all of them do. I do remember I have had year groups where it's been fairly evenly split. I think a lot of people feel that TV news is more immediate because of the representations of the visual representations, and people don't always trust newspapers sort of inherently because they're aware of maybe political bias and ownership. But I always play devil's advocate with that and talk about how we should be aware of framing and editing, and how just because something is we film something, it doesn't mean that it couldn't be manipulated. I also talk about the fact that perhaps whilst a newspaper has maybe 20, 30, 40, maybe even up to 100 stories in it of things going on in the world, a half-hour news broadcast will only perhaps cherry pick 7 or 8 maximum to talk about. And how is that a representation of reality when there are literally millions of things happening in the world? So it's an interesting debate. There is no real answer, of course. There's no solution to this. So I think from your perspective, it's interesting maybe just to list 2, 3, perhaps 4 different reasons why you would say newspapers are more real than TV news, and do the opposite. Look, give yourself a handful of reasons why you believe that TV news is more real than newspapers. And it's important to have interesting arguments on both sides of the story, and of course considering much of the media theory and theoretical framework that we're looking at, particularly Stuart Hall's construction of representation. Anyway, more on representations later. Let's have a think about news, in particular the way that it's been seen in the past, because I think there's a lot of mythology surrounding news and how news happens. And this image of the roving reporter going out, collecting the story and typing it back up for a grizzled boss is something that we've got from the movies and we still think of as news. But of course it's not something that's complete and fully formed. There are no full stories out there waiting to be reported. News, like any other type of media, is created, it's constructed. It's not even gathered. It's actually paid for these days. It's bought and sold between different agencies across Europe, negotiating and bargaining over different stories. And as I said before, it just like any other kind of form of communication, news is a construction. But there are a few questions we can ask. What does news value? What I'd like you to do is write a list of different reasons why something might be considered newsworthy. This is a really interesting exercise. Think about the kind of things that become story, things that make it onto the TV, things that make it into the newspapers. All of them will have certain characteristics and qualities that means that they are considered newsworthy. What are those characteristics and qualities? And in your opinion, are some characteristics or qualities considered to be more newsworthy than others? Well, luckily for us, this is something that has been studied time immemorial for media studies students, something that's, as long as there's been news, there's been an analysis of news values. And so there are a pretty comprehensive list that we can look at, remember and study, and of course that we can apply as well. So of these news values, which you should have a link to a Sway presentation of those values, which of those news values would you say would be most relevant for TV news? Which would you say would be most relevant for newspapers? And are there any which you would say probably are used just as much as each other? Now I'm going to ask you to watch this opening sequence from an ITN news bulletin, and write down the different stories first of all. There's I think 4 in total, 4 or 5, and write down the different news values that have obviously been considered when this selection process was happening.
Boris Johnson is forced to answer the Commons as Parliament is recalled, but the arguments appear more angry and bitter than ever.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. Yes.
But on a day of extraordinary exchanges, it was his response to an MP urging him to moderate his language, referencing her murdered colleague Jo Cox, that drew the most anger.
And we stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
The Prime Minister was unrepentant about yesterday's Supreme Court in an exclusive interview with Robert Peston earlier. We'll ask what on earth might happen next. Also in News at 10 tonight.
He's made me more famous and I've made him more famous.
Trump, the Ukrainian president, and the phone call now released that's led to an impeachment inquiry. Earth on the edge. Tom Clark is in Greenland as the UN warns hundreds of millions of people are at risk from melting ice caps, whilst Rachel Younger reports from the Pacific, where islands are already disappearing.
These trees once grew in the very heart of Sogamo's rainforest. They're now all that's left of land swallowed up by the sea. That's because more than half of this island has simply vanished.
And Emma Thompson tells me why she has such admiration for young climate change protesters.
They made me feel, makes me cry to think of it, because they made me feel so ashamed.
And Archie meets the Archbishop. But who does he remind you of?
So, 4 or 5 stories there, pretty typical opening to an ITN half-hour news bulletin. We'll very quickly go through some of these. I'm sure you had a lot of these on your list. The first story obviously being about Brexit and Parliament is a story that has both continuity and currency. It's a continuing saga, shall we say, that's been rattling on since 2016. And so, of course, people are familiar with the story and have a degree of knowledge going on from previous stories or previous chapters of the story. I would say it's kind of a negativity story as well. I think it's been chosen because it does represent Parliament as a dysfunctional place of hostility and arguments, some shots of some very angry and upset looking people, and of course referring back again in an aspect of continuity to the murder of MP Jo Cox. Of course, the reason it leads with this story is because of the closeness to home. This is the UK's Parliament. This is our government. And so a story that revolves around our own society and politics is much more likely to lead than any other kinds of stories. And there's a few others that we could throw in here, particularly personality. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson is seen as a larger-than-life figure who himself can make news. And of course, in this aspect is. So we move on to the next story and stick with the same news value of personality. The American President Donald Trump is again someone who is always newsworthy. Now, this is a story that has continuity because his continuing presidency has courted a lot of controversy as it's gone on ever since he was made president, again, at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. There is almost a sort of predictability about this story. It's discussing how impeachment proceedings began after the phone conversation he had with the Ukrainian Prime Minister. And so there was a lot building up to this. So there was kind of an expectedness of this story developing in the way that it has. And of course, even though it's not the UK, America is considered to be a sort of an elite nation. And I suppose in this instance, Trump an elite person. The next story is quite different. It's one about melting ice caps and rising sea levels on Pacific islands. And I think pretty obviously this is quite a negative story. It's talking about the impact of climate change and, the kind of negative aspects of that. So I think part of this is to do with the size as well. Whilst it's not the leading story here, it is a story that has, or they're trying to demonstrate will have an impact on many, many, many people across the globe. So size might be something you've considered here. And of course currency, because the global warming story is something that's been going on for years and years now. I also believe there's a kind of simplicity to this story, even though climate change and is a very complicated issue and can be represented in many ways. The way that ITN has represented this particular aspect of the story is quite simple. Bad things are happening. The polar ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, and it's sort of keeping it as simple as that to talk about this story. Sticking with that as well, they use that as a way of moving into the next story, which is the interview with actress and activist Emma Thompson. I suppose whilst she is famous to certain sections of society, she's not to everyone, but she would be considered an elite person or a personality. There's a certain amount of exclusivity to this. I don't think Emma Thompson was giving interviews to lots of people, so ITN seemed to have the exclusive here. And I think this adds a layer of meaningfulness to the past two stories here, rather than it just being a straightforward, simple scientific measure of ice caps melting, sea levels rising. Emma Thompson offers what seems to be a kind of human element. She's quite emotional and just demonstrates that. And finally, there's got to be a royal family story somewhere along the way. Again, closeness to home, because it's something that we can relate to in the UK. Continuity with the Meghan and Harry story unfolding, and of course the recent birth of their baby Archie. So a bit of continuity and currency, elite persons, and I suppose simplicity for this one as well, ending on a more positive note. Okay, so that's roughly how you can apply these news values. I think you'll always look out for them now. The good thing to do is just have those values memorised. Every time you see a news story, think which of the different values are the reasons why that story has been chosen. But news is more complicated than just picking out a set of values. There is this element we call agenda setting as well, which is a lot more ideological than just appealing to an audience. News organisations set up an agenda of topics, and that forms the news. The editors choose the news, and in doing so they choose the agenda of items which become our view as an audience as to what is important in the world. So if you imagine, if you are an editor picking out the 7 or 8 stories from the millions that are there, or even if you're the editor of a newspaper picking out 100 stories from the millions of different things that happen in the world, what you're doing is actually representing the world and subtly shaping the view of the world that your audience has. And that's really the first question. What is the possible impact on the audience if encoders are setting an agenda and encoding their own values into the news? So if you are a newspaper editor or owner and you are choosing what stories goes onto your paper or onto your TV show, what impact might there be on the audience here? Well, a lot of this is tied to what's called the agenda setting function theory. There's a great little video made by an Australian lecturer in his series Media in Minutes. I'm going to play it now, and all I'd like you to do is just make some notes about what the agenda setting function theory is.
Welcome to Media in Minutes, where I talk you through important concepts in media and communication. Today we're looking at the agenda setting function theory, which suggests that the media can't tell you what to think, but it can tell you what to think about. The agenda setting function theory was developed by Maxwell McCombs and Donald Shaw in 1972 as a result of their study of North Carolina voters during the 1968 presidential election campaign. This study found a correlation between issues that voters believed were important and issues that the media gave prominence to. McCombs and Shaw argued that the media use a number of cues to indicate the importance of an issue. On the front page of a newspaper, for example, the importance of a story is indicated by the size of its heading. Likewise, a story that appears on the front page is more important than a story that appears on page 5. According to this theory, the media has the power to focus public discussion on particular issues. Again, it can't tell us what to think, but it can tell us what to think about. In 1998, McCombs increased the scope of this theory to include a phenomenon called framing. He argued that in addition to telling us what to think about, the media can also tell us how to think about a story. News reports might focus on one particular aspect of an issue or report about something in a particular way. In Australia, we see this happening with news reports about asylum seekers. The Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun, which are both owned by News Corporation, seem to frame the issue in a particular way, with headlines like 35 asylum sneakers costing us a packet and boat people in our suburbs. Here, the refugee story is framed as a social and economic burden on the Australian people. These stories could be framed to focus on humanitarian issues or whether Australia is meeting its international obligations. A number of studies have been done that make the agenda-setting function theory seem pretty plausible. Typically, they show a correlation between the number of news stories on an issue and how important people think the issue is. Although the agenda-setting function theory has been around since the 1970s, it's still a great way to think about communication and media influence.
So it's a really handy theory and very succinctly described there about understanding how ideology ends up in our news. Ideology is a key part of news and agenda setting, really, even if we feel that the news is something that should be free of ideology and just reporting of straightforward facts, figures and information. Unfortunately, there are very few, if any, news agencies which are free from ideological content. One that obviously should be is the BBC, as it is supposed to serve an entire people and be unbiased, although, as we've discussed many times before, that is the source of constant contention amongst some people who believe it is on the right and others who believe it's too far on the left. What we can be sure of is that all other news companies and agencies are owned by someone else, usually have a commercial interest or are owned by an individual, and therefore there is an agenda that is often set that reflects the ideologies and beliefs of that particular individual or corporate entity. However, it's not just a straightforward case of whatever the individual owner or corporate entity says is believed by the audience. Hopefully you can see that there are ways in which this is different from the news having a direct impact on us. How so? Can you explain why this is different from just us seeing the news and immediately believing or acting on what we see? Hopefully your thoughts on this will in some way remind you of another theory we've looked at, George Gerbner's cultivation model. So just scribble down what you remember about Gerbner's cultivation model, or revisit notes if you need to, and draw comparisons. How is the agenda setting function theory similar to cultivation model? So we're going to move away now from broadcast news and focus more on newspapers. We will come back to agenda setting and news values. Of course, they're going to be important in our study, but I want to start thinking about the different newspapers there are and actually start to put newspapers into different categories. So very first of all, and I'm quite aware that this is a medium which is not appealing to a younger demographic as much as it was perhaps once upon a time, but I'd just simply like to ask you to list as many different newspapers as you possibly can. Take the time and get as many down as you can. Okay, so I'm actually going to concentrate on a selection of newspapers. I'm showing a short video which will showcase a bunch of different newspapers, and I'd like you to put them into 3 categories, just 3 different categories, and justify your reasons for this. There is one spanner in the works. One of these newspapers does not belong in any of the 3 groups. There is an odd one out, one that you will have to discard. So your newspapers are the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Star, the Sun, don't buy the Sun, the Daily Express, the Guardian, Liverpool Echo, the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, the Eye, and the Financial Times. So these go into 3 different categories. You can select whichever ones you want to go into those categories. You must have a reason for that though. And the spanner in the works is that one of these papers is an odd one out and won't fit into the 3 categories we're looking for. So see what you think, see if you can get them. Okay, well, as we continue the video, I think it will become clear which one we need to get rid of. That's right. The Echo is the odd one out here because, of course, what we're looking at are national daily papers. The Echo is a regional paper and not a national paper. Our first pile, if you like, are these 3 newspapers: the Star, the Mirror, and the Sun. Don't buy the Sun. Our second pile of papers are the Mail, the Express, and the Eye. And that leaves us with 4 newspapers that will make up our third and final category. The Times, the Guardian, the Daily Telegraph and the Financial Times makes our third and final category. Telegraph, Financial Times, and Guardian. Pile number 2, the Eye, the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. In the third pile, the Star, the Mirror and the Sun. Don't buy the Sun. So let's have a look at the reasons why. As I said, we're going to look at the national dailies, and all of those papers, all 10 of them are the national dailies in the UK. We split these into those 3 sections I was going to told you about. These loosely actually fit into 2 categories, one that we call tabloids and one that we call broadsheets, and both of these are words that hopefully you'll have heard before. Tabloids can be further subdivided, and that was the division I made, into red tops and middle market or mid-market tabloids. And no prizes for guessing which the red tops are: the Sun, the Mirror and the Star. The mid-market are the Express, the Mail and the Eye. And then you've got a whole nother section of the broadsheet newspapers. These include the Telegraph, the Guardian, the Times, the Financial Times, and the Independent, which, if you'll notice from the asterisk there, is still a national daily newspaper which doesn't have a newspaper form. It used to for, I think, getting on for 20 years, was a sort of mainstay of newspaper publishing in the UK, but it ceased publication in its paper form 3 or 4 years ago and is now only online. All the rest are available to buy in newsagents, supermarkets, and are produced daily to represent national news. And those are the 3 categories that we look at, though. Broadsheets, and then tabloids split into 2, the red tops and the middle market. And before we look at the differences between those different types of newspapers, and we must go back to kind of the bread and butter of media studies, really, and think about semiotic analyses. Before we can determine what makes them different, we must revisit some old skills here and just kind of remember what we do in media studies. So I'm going to ask you to think of a typical newspaper front page. What things could be analysed about it? Think of anything that you could analyse. Well, I'm sure you came up with a few ideas. We could specifically look at things like the masthead, which is the title of the paper, the layout of the newspaper, the language used, and of course the main image. And as we go on through our study of newspapers, you'll see that we look at each of these in quite some detail. I'm going to do a semiotic analysis of a masthead of a newspaper, and then I'm going to ask you to do the same. And just to make it somewhat easier for you to choose which masthead you analyse, I'm going to pick the newspaper that isn't a newspaper. I'm going to choose the Independent. First of all, because it's got quite a nice masthead, or it used to have quite a nice masthead, even though it changed a few times over the years. So let's think about all the different things that we could analyse about this, and I'll walk our way through these. I'm going to start with the emblem. Most newspaper mastheads have an emblem or badge or a mascot or some kind of imagery included in them. In the case of the Independent, this image of the eagle is a powerful symbol. It has connotations of being independent and lonesome, if you like, doing its own thing. Interestingly, the spread eagle with its talons sort of holding a newspaper reinforces this myth that actually news is something that can be collected and delivered to its reader, moving away from that kind of newer model of news agencies and so on. So it's quite interesting for creating a mythology about what news is. I'm going to look at font next. In particular, the use of the uppercase in this font, and the red colour is of course very powerful. It's very sure of itself. It has this feeling of something that's immovable. The font itself is even called Impact, although they wouldn't expect the reader to necessarily know that. You get a real sense that this is here to stay, ironically, and very, very powerful, very sure of what it's going to be saying. But interestingly, with the word the being slightly different, serif face, you get this really interesting mixture of fonts. You've got the serif and the sans serif. Creates a feeling of old and new, something that's modern, but also something that's established and reliable. And it's quite a clever sort of use of typeface to create meaning. Of course, the key thing, more than anything to do with typography or imagery, is the choice of the name itself. I'm sure editors and proprietors spend absolutely ages coming up with names for newspapers. This one, The Independent, feels fairly obvious, but it's worth analysis. Of course, the word itself has many connotations. Something that stands alone, perhaps implying integrity by standing by itself, or seeing things which other organisations don't see. A newspaper that can see things with a unique perspective. And for a newspaper, they are quite obviously trying to shed any ideas that they have any commercial or corporate ties and influences. As I said, I think one of the key reasons why there is a lot of distrust about newspapers is because audiences are constantly aware that there is an owner somewhere or an advertiser somewhere that is possibly having an influence on the news output of that particular paper. And the name The Independent suggests, in fact, they used to use this as a strapline, free from commercial or proprietorial or political bias in any way. Unlike other newspapers, The Independent was always keen to stay away from supporting any one particular political party, whereas other newspapers, as we'll find out as we go on, very much wear their political allegiances on their sleeve. So I'd like you to do your own semiotic analysis of a national daily newspaper of your choice. Pick any of the daily nationals that we've just talked about, broadsheet or tabloid, mid-market or red top, and just as I've done here, work your way through a discussion of the imagery, typography, and of course, most importantly, the word itself. And now this is the biggest task of the session, and that's to get an understanding of and to draw out the differences between tabloids and broadsheet newspapers. There are lots of differences between the two different styles of newspapers, and there are a number of differences between mid-market and red top tabloids, but I want you to get a sense of the key differences and in some cases similarities between broadsheets and tabloids. The things you'll be able to look for: literary techniques and devices. The use of language is obviously very important in defining the differences between tabloids and broadsheets. Different kind of writers, different types of writing. Not just in headlines, which is obviously a key part, but also the main body of stories. Way information is delivered. This is what's known as the who, what, when, where, why, and how. How quickly are you given all the facts of a story? How is it told to us? Is it more of a long-form journalistic storytelling style, or does it feel like it could be summarised in bullet point form? And of course, the way that the information is delivered to a reader, the amount of knowledge or expectation of knowledge that the reader should already have, tells us quite a lot about who the average reader, the target audience, might be. Not just the literary techniques and things like alliteration or personification or anything like that, but of course the use of emotive language is important, and hopefully you'll notice quite key differences in the way that emotive language is used. I'm not saying that only one type of newspaper will try and engage with their audience on an emotional level, but have a look at the way emotive language is utilised and employed by a paper. And of course, mode of address. How does the paper attempt to appeal to its audience? How does it try to create that bond between the audience and the newspaper? So you're looking for some main differences here, but also some similarities between the two papers. Pick any tabloid, any broadsheet, and draw those differences out. Once you've got through those kind of, if you like, stylistic differences, you'll be able to look a bit more at the ideological content and those other appeals, the news values. So pick some stories out from each of your papers, the tabloid and the broadsheet. Think about what those stories are about and why they've been picked, and make notes on the values. List the values that have been chosen for that particular story. Then also make notes on the agenda that's being set. In other words, find evidence for the paper's ideologies. And the obvious one to do is to find the political allegiance of the newspaper, which sometimes is very obvious, sometimes is a little bit less so. But I would say, whilst that is an important and key part of agenda setting, it's not the only aspect. Don't just look for political agenda or bias, but also look for other ideological concerns. How does that newspaper want you or want the audience to see the world? How does it want us to feel about the world? What does it suggest is important and value? You've done this with other media products, and you should be able to do it with this. So, quite a big task to complete, but one that hopefully is incredibly valuable in helping you to understand the differences between tabloid and broadsheet newspapers. And finally, a small task and consideration, the idea of headline writing, because of course many newspapers actually attract a lot of fame, and of course whilst they're staring at you from that huge bank of colossal amount of different newspapers and magazines at a newsagents or in a supermarket, you have to select one based perhaps on the headline alone. I'm going to give you a selection of fictional stories to choose, and I'm going to ask you to write a headline for a broadsheet version and the tabloid version. Before we do that, we'll just look at some recent and maybe not so recent headlines and look at some of the techniques that I used. Puns are an obvious one, where there is a sort of play on words in a kind of jokey way. Basic wordplay are often there, but used to kind of create humour. Things like "I've been a snotty girl," referring to Nigella Lawson being caught with cocaine instead of naughty girl. There are often references to other people. Is Jez the two of us out there, referring to former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. Naming Private Ryan's quite I suppose a clever one. This was after a super injunction where Ryan Giggs tried to protect himself from being named in a case. Of course, the intertextual reference to the Steven Spielberg film Saving Private Ryan. Lots of plays on words, lots of intertextual references. I have to say, my own favourite headline is actually a sports headline, so it's from the back pages of a newspaper. Unfortunately, I believe this was from The Sun, which is not a paper I'm a fan of, but this headline was too good to go unnoticed. It's a headline from quite a few years ago now, when the third division minnows, the small Inverness Caledonian Thistle, beat the mighty Celtic, who were champions at the time and pretty much unbeatable in the Scottish League. Celtic were beaten by the Inverness Caledonian Thistles, or Cali as they're nicknamed, 3-1 in a cup match. And the Sun ran with this sporting headline: "Super Cali, go ballistic, Celtic are atrocious." And as much as I dislike the Sun, I can't help but smile whenever I see that particular headline. If you were the guy who wrote that headline, you might as well retire the next day, because you're not going to write anything as good as that ever again. Anyway, so these are the kind of techniques and humorous things that particularly the tabloids use. From your research and analysis, you'll know that the broadsheets are a lot more formal. I'd like you to write a headline for both broadsheet and tabloid from one of the three stories. Okay, so pick one of these, whichever one you want, and I want a tabloid styly headline and a broadsheet style headline for whichever story you pick. So here are your three stories. Number one, a new recession is so bad that the Queen is having to make her own spending cuts at Buckingham Palace. And you can make up exactly what those spending cuts would be, whatever you want. Number two, a Premier League footballer loses £1 million in a single night at a casino. Doesn't sound actually too far-fetched, that one, does it? I'm sure that has probably happened. But this is a make-believe story. You can choose that to be a particular Premier League footballer if you want. And then thirdly, a small English town is evacuated after a minor earthquake tremors. So a story which you can either ramp up the seriousness and exaggerate and sensationalise it, or maybe create a sort of sense of humour about how unusual this would be in the UK. It's up to you. Use the techniques of the headline writing, but one that's appropriate for a tabloid and one that's appropriate for a broadsheet. And that ends our introduction to news values and news agendas, but also, of course, the differences between broadsheet and tabloid newspapers.